Hell's Angels biker took little girl into his care after her escape. What happened next will change her life forever. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Jake, Razor, Morrison had been riding alone for hours, his Harley's engine roaring through the empty streets. The cool evening air whipped past him as he leaned into the turns, the leather jacket on his broad shoulders flapping with the wind. He was a man of few words, and his life had been shaped by years on the road, under the banner of the Hells Angels. His hands were calloused, his face weathered, marked by the passage of time and the choices he had made. But tonight, something felt different. As Jake approached a quiet stretch of road, he heard a faint sound. At first, it was barely noticeable, a soft whimper, almost lost in the noise of the bike's engine. But then it came again, louder this time. A cry. His instincts kicked in. He slowed down, eyes scanning the roadside, the beam of his headlight cutting through the darkness. And then he saw her. A little girl, no older than 8, huddled against a dilapidated fence, trembling from the cold. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted with dirt, and she looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes. Jake's heart tightened. He wasn't the kind of guy who got involved in other people's problems. But something about this moment made him stop. His eyes softened, and without thinking, he dismounted his bike and walked over to her. She flinched as he approached, her hands trembling. "Hey, it's okay," Jake said, his voice rough but gentle, a stark contrast to his imposing figure. The little girl blinked, clearly confused. "You're safe now," he added, kneeling down to her level. He could see the fear in her eyes, the raw panic. But there was something else too, a silent plea for help. "What happened to you?" he asked. The girl didn't answer right away. She just stared at him, unsure whether to trust him. "It's okay," Jake repeated, more softly this time. "I'm not going to hurt you." The words were simple, but they held a weight of sincerity. Slowly, the girl seemed to relax, her body slumping in exhaustion. Jake knew she needed help, and fast. He carefully helped her to her feet, wrapping his jacket around her tiny frame. "Let's get you out of here," he said, his voice firm but kind. As he led her to his bike, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another chance encounter. Something had changed in him the moment he saw her. They both knew it, even if neither could articulate it yet. Jake helped her onto the bike, holding her steady as they rode off into the night. The road stretched out ahead, but there was a new sense of purpose in his movements. As they headed toward his place, Jake couldn't help but think about the life he had lived. He had always kept his emotions buried, never allowing anyone too close. But this little girl, with her haunted eyes and fragile frame, was changing that. They arrived at his garage, a rundown building tucked away on the outskirts of town. Jake helped her off the bike, leading her inside where it was warmer. He made sure she was comfortable on an old couch, then set to work cleaning her wounds. As he tended to her, a strange feeling washed over him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Compassion. It felt unfamiliar, but it was undeniable. For the first time in a long time, Jake wasn't thinking about the next ride, the next fight, or the next chapter in his solitary life. He was thinking about someone else, and that someone was changing his world. Jake stood by the door, his broad frame blocking out the dim light from the street as he looked at the little girl on the couch. Emma, her small body wrapped tightly in his leather jacket, had finally fallen asleep. The exhaustion from the night's events had taken its toll on her, and now, in the warmth of the garage, she was finally getting the rest she so desperately needed. Jake watched her for a moment, his thoughts swirling. He hadn't planned on this. He hadn't planned on stopping. His life had always been about moving forward, riding solo, never looking back. But then he had seen her, trembling and alone, and something inside him had snapped. He could still feel the weight of her small form in his arms, the fear in her eyes when she had first looked up at him. It had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He turned away from the couch, running a hand through his graying hair. He had never been good at dealing with emotions, never been the type to let anyone close. He had learned long ago that getting attached only led to pain. The Hells Angels had taught him that loyalty, brotherhood, but also the cold reality of life on the edge. But tonight, with Emma, things felt different. He couldn't ignore it. He walked over to his workbench, his hands instinctively reaching for his tools. He didn't know why, but he felt the need to do something, anything, to take his mind off the weight of the situation. His eyes wandered over the scattered bike parts, the worn leather jacket, the dusty tools that had been his companions for years. The garage had been his sanctuary, a place where he could escape from the chaos of the world. But now, it felt different. It felt empty. He paused, looking over at Emma again. She was safe for now, but he knew that wouldn't last. He had heard the sirens earlier, and they weren't the only sound he had heard in the night. There were other voices too, voices that didn't belong here. He couldn't let them find her. His eyes narrowed as his thoughts shifted to the future. He wasn't sure what had driven him to stop for Emma, but he couldn't turn his back on her now. He had a feeling she was more than just a little girl in need of help. He could sense it in his bones. The weight of her presence in his life was more than just a fleeting moment. It was a turning point, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. As the minutes ticked by, Jake continued to work in silence. He didn't mind the solitude. He never had. But tonight, with Emma asleep in the corner, it was different. The silence was heavy, the kind of quiet that weighed on your chest. He found himself glancing over at her again, his heart tightening as he watched her small chest rise and fall with each breath. He had always prided himself on being tough, on being able to handle anything the world threw his way. But now, in this quiet moment, he felt something stir within him that he hadn't felt in years, a need to protect, a desire to shield her from whatever dangers lay outside. His mind wandered back to the years he had spent riding with the Hells Angels, the chaos, the fights, the endless nights on the road. But it wasn't until now that he realized how empty it had all been. He had spent so much of his life running from his past, from his mistakes. But now, with Emma in his care, he wasn't sure he could keep running anymore. He let out a deep breath, pushing the thoughts aside for the moment. There would be time for reflection later. For now, all that mattered was making sure Emma was safe. Jake moved over to the small couch where Emma lay. Her face was peaceful in sleep, the fear and uncertainty from earlier gone. He couldn't help but smile a little, despite himself. She looked so small, so fragile, and yet there was something about her that made him want to keep her safe. He ran a hand over his face, suddenly feeling the weight of his years. He had never been a father, never wanted to be. But something about Emma, something about the way she had looked at him with trust and desperation, made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he could do something more with his life than just ride and fight. He stood up, stretching his stiff muscles, and walked to the small kitchenette in the back of the garage. His hands worked automatically, preparing a cup of coffee. It was a routine, one that didn't require thinking. But tonight, even the simple task of brewing coffee felt different. A choice, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of it. He had a feeling that this was only the beginning of a journey he wasn't ready for, but a journey he had to take, for both of them. The morning light filtered through the grimy windows of Jake's garage, casting long, faded shadows across the concrete floor. The quiet of the early hours settled around him as he sat at his workbench, a mug of coffee in his hands. He glanced over at Emma, still asleep on the couch, wrapped in his leather jacket. He hadn't expected this, any of this. His life had always been about keeping to himself, staying on the move, and avoiding attachments. But now, with the girl resting in his garage, something inside him stirred. He hadn't been ready for it. Hell, he hadn't wanted it. But there she was. He couldn't turn away. It had been a few hours since she had fallen asleep, but Jake had found himself unable to do the same. His mind raced with thoughts he couldn't quiet. The night had been a blur of chaos and confusion, but now, as the sun rose and painted the sky with soft hues of pink and orange, the weight of everything began to settle in. He looked down at his hands, calloused and rough, the hands that had seen more than their fair share of violence and hardship. But these same hands had held Emma gently, making sure she was safe, making sure she didn't feel alone. It was a feeling he wasn't used to, compassion, and it scared him. The truth was, he didn't know what he was supposed to do. He wasn't a hero, not by any stretch of the imagination. He was just a biker, a man who had spent his life riding through the world with a cold heart and a sense of detachment. But something about Emma had cracked through that cold exterior. He could still hear her voice in his head, whispering the words that had struck him deep. "I thought I was going to die, but you saved me." Those words had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He had spent so many years pretending that emotions didn't matter, that getting attached to anyone was a mistake. But now, looking at the little girl who had trusted him, who had clung to him like he was her lifeline, he wasn't sure anymore. Jake ran a hand over his face, rubbing his eyes as if to clear the thoughts swirling in his head. He couldn't let himself think too much about it. He had a job to do, and he needed to stay focused. He had to make sure Emma was safe, make sure no one would hurt her. But the deeper he looked into her eyes, the more he realized that he wasn't just protecting her. She was changing him. The sound of the front door creaking open broke his thoughts. He looked up to see the old woman, Mrs. Henderson, standing in the doorway. She had been the one to bring him the casserole the night before, the one person in the small town who had treated him with some semblance of kindness. "How's she doing?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice soft but concerned. Jake nodded slowly, still not fully used to someone asking about his well-being, let alone Emma's. "She's fine. She's sleeping." Mrs. Henderson stepped inside, her eyes glancing over at the couch where Emma lay. "Poor thing," she muttered. "She's had a rough time, hasn't she?" Jake didn't respond. There were no words that could explain what had happened to Emma, not yet. He wasn't ready to share that much. But Mrs. Henderson didn't press. Instead, she walked over to the small kitchen area and poured herself a cup of coffee. "You know," she said, glancing back at Jake, "I've seen that look before. The one you're wearing." Jake raised an eyebrow, unsure of what she meant. Mrs. Henderson smiled gently. "It's the look of someone who's trying to fight what's right in front of them." Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. He wasn't sure he liked where this conversation was headed. "I'm just trying to do what's best for her," he muttered. "That's all." Mrs. Henderson nodded knowingly, but didn't push any further. "I'm sure you are. But sometimes, doing what's best for someone means doing what's best for yourself too. You've been running from something for a long time, Jake." Keep his feelings buried deep. He had never let anyone close enough to see the cracks in his armor. But Emma was different. The way she had looked at him, the way she had trusted him, it made him question everything he had built for himself. Mrs. Henderson seemed to sense his discomfort and let the silence stretch between them. After a few moments, she spoke again, her voice softer this time. "You know, I've seen a lot of things in my time, but I've never seen a man like you care so much. Not for anyone but yourself." Jake couldn't hide the surprise on his face. Mrs. Henderson was right. He hadn't cared about anyone in years. But now, with Emma in his life, things were changing. Slowly, painfully, but surely. "I didn't ask for this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Henderson didn't reply immediately. She just sipped her coffee, watching him with an understanding look in her eyes. "Maybe you didn't. But sometimes, Jake, the things that find us aren't things we choose. But they're the things that matter most." Jake felt a lump form in his throat. He couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to him like that, with such care, such compassion. He had spent so long pushing people away, hiding from the world, that he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen, to be understood. Mrs. Henderson finished her coffee and set the mug down on the counter. "I'll leave you to it," she said. "But you know where to find me if you need anything." Jake nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude he wasn't used to. He watched as she left, closing the door behind her. The room grew quieter again, but the silence didn't feel as heavy this time. As Jake looked back over at Emma, he felt a small sense of peace settle in. Maybe Mrs. Henderson was right. Maybe it was time to stop running. The days passed slowly, and Jake found himself adjusting to a new rhythm. He woke up each morning to the sound of the world outside his garage, but inside, the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't the cold silence he had lived with for so long. There was a quiet hum of life now. Emma was still sleeping when he got up, but he had gotten into the habit of checking on her every morning. She looked peaceful, her small form curled up in the blanket he had given her. She wasn't his daughter, not by blood. But in those early mornings, he found himself feeling a protective instinct for her that he hadn't expected. His life had always been about keeping to himself, keeping moving, keeping the past buried. But now, Emma had shown up, and she was changing everything. It wasn't just about keeping her safe anymore. It was about doing right by her. That thought was new to him. As the days stretched on, Emma began to settle into a routine. She would wake up, always a little hesitant at first, and Jake would offer her something warm to eat. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them wasn't awkward. It felt like a space where they were both allowed to breathe, allowed to just exist without explanation. But one afternoon, as Jake was working on a bike in the corner of the garage, Emma wandered up to him, her small feet padding softly on the concrete floor. "Jake?" she asked, her voice tentative. He looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yeah. Are you a good guy?" she asked, her eyes serious, searching his face for an answer. Jake froze. The question caught him off guard. He had spent his entire life wearing the Hell's Angels patch like armor, carrying a reputation built on fear and strength. But here was this little girl, looking at him like he was someone who could be trusted. He cleared his throat, unsure how to respond. "I try to be," he finally said, his voice low. Emma nodded, as if that answer was enough. She didn't push him for more. She didn't need to. It was a simple moment, but for Jake, it was a turning point. He had never thought about himself in those terms before. He had always lived by the code of his past. Keep moving, stay tough, and never let anyone in. But here was this little girl, who had nothing, asking him if he was a good guy. And for the first time, Jake felt like he might just have the chance to be. Later that evening, after dinner, Emma sat at the small table with a piece of paper and a crayon, drawing. She had taken to drawing during their quiet evenings together. It was her way of filling the silence, of processing everything that had happened. She never spoke much about her past, and Jake didn't ask. He knew better than to pry. But sometimes, when she was lost in her drawings, he would catch a glimpse of the pain behind her eyes. The way she focused on the paper like it was the only thing holding her together. Jake watched her for a moment before standing up and walking over. He hesitated, unsure of how to approach her. "You doing okay?" he asked gently. She looked up at him, her face softening, but there was a hint of something deeper in her gaze. "I miss my mom," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to do. His whole life had been spent avoiding vulnerability, avoiding anything that made him feel too much. But here, in this moment, with Emma's simple confession, everything felt raw. He knelt down beside her, looking at her drawing. "I know you do," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll help you through this." Emma didn't say anything more. She just nodded, as if that was all she needed to hear. For the rest of the evening, Jake stayed close by her side, watching as she drew, as she tried to make sense of everything. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt like a shared understanding, something neither of them had to explain. The next day, when Emma woke up, she seemed different. She wasn't as withdrawn as she had been in the days before. She smiled at Jake when she saw him in the kitchen, her eyes a little brighter. It was a small change, but to Jake, it felt like a breakthrough. "What's on the agenda today?" she asked, her voice more confident than it had been. Jake smiled back, a rare genuine smile. "We'll figure something out," he said. As the days went by, Jake found himself looking forward to these small moments with Emma. It wasn't just about keeping her safe anymore. It was about being a part of her life. He had never allowed himself to be a part of anyone's life before, but now, with Emma, it felt like the beginning of something new, something worth fighting for. And for the first time in years, Jake realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as lost as he thought. He had someone to care for now, someone who needed him. And in that, he found a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was missing. The sun had barely risen, and Jake was already up, his eyes scanning the quiet streets outside the garage. It had become his routine. Early mornings, alone in the stillness, with only the hum of the distant city and the rustle of the wind through the trees. Emma was still asleep in the corner, wrapped up in the same blanket he had given her the night before. He couldn't explain it, but something about having her there made the place feel more alive. It wasn't the noise of people or the bustle of the city. It was something quieter, something more subtle. It was the feeling of responsibility, something Jake had never truly known. He had spent his whole life avoiding anything that could tie him down, but Emma, with her trust and her vulnerability, had found a way to make him care. It wasn't something he could easily shake off. As the morning wore on, Jake found himself distracted. He tried to focus on the bike he was working on, tightening bolts and adjusting the gears, but his mind kept drifting back to Emma. He hadn't meant for any of this to happen. She had just appeared out of nowhere, like a lost soul in need of help. And now, here he was, thinking about her like she was family. It didn't make sense. But nothing about this situation made sense. His thoughts were interrupted when he heard Emma stirring on the couch. She rubbed her eyes and sat up, looking around the room as if trying to remember where she was. Her small face, still sleepy, looked up at him with a quiet smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft but genuine. Jake nodded in return, trying to hide the sudden warmth that spread through him at the sound of her voice. "Morning, kid. How'd you sleep?" "Good," Emma replied, stretching her arms above her head. "Better than last night." She glanced at the bike Jake had been working on and then back at him. "Are you going to fix that one today?" Jake chuckled softly. "Yeah, probably. It's been sitting here for a while, and I've been putting it off." "Can I help?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Jake was taken aback. Help? The last thing he had expected was for a little girl to offer to help him fix a motorcycle. But something in her expression, the eagerness and innocence of it, made him pause. He thought for a moment. He had always worked alone. He had always preferred it that way. But now, with Emma here, things felt different. "Sure," Jake said after a beat, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I could use an extra set of hands." Emma grinned, her face lighting up as she jumped to her feet. "What can I do?" Jake gestured to the parts scattered across the workbench. "Well, you can start by handing me the wrenches. They're over there." Emma eagerly scrambled over to the tools, her small hands searching through the pile until she found the wrench Jake had asked for. She handed it to him with a sense of pride, her eyes shining. Jake worked on the bike, guiding her through the process, explaining the tools and the parts. She listened intently, asking questions when she didn't understand, and even offering suggestions that made Jake raise an eyebrow in surprise. It was hard to believe that a few days ago, this little girl had been a stranger to him, someone he hadn't even known existed. And now, here she was, helping him work on a motorcycle, asking questions, and contributing in ways he hadn't expected. It felt good. It felt like they were a team, even though they had just met. As the hours passed, Jake couldn't help but notice how much Emma had opened up. She had started talking more, sharing little pieces of herself in between handing him tools or holding parts in place. She told him about her mom, how she had loved to draw and always try to make her laugh. Jake didn't ask for details, but she shared them anyway, as if she knew he wasn't going to judge her. They worked in silence for a while after that, the sound of the wrenches clinking and the bike's engine humming softly in the background. Emma's presence in the garage was no longer just a distraction. It felt like a natural part of the day, like she belonged there as much as he did. But as they wrapped up for the day, a thought nagged at Jake's mind. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep doing this. How much longer he could keep pretending that everything was fine, that he wasn't scared of what was happening between him and Emma. He had spent so many years keeping people at arm's length, pushing them away, protecting himself from any kind of vulnerability. And now, with Emma, it was like he was being forced to confront everything he had been running from. He didn't know what to do with that. But what he did know was that he couldn't just send her away. Not after everything they had shared. He walked over to the small fridge in the corner of the garage and grabbed a bottle of water, offering one to Emma. She took it with a grateful smile. "Thanks, Jake," she said softly. He nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle on him. "No problem, kid. You've earned it." Emma smiled, and for the first time, Jake felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. The next few days felt like a quiet routine. Emma had settled into a new rhythm with Jake, and the two of them worked together in the garage each day. He wasn't sure when it happened, but somehow, the garage had stopped feeling like just a place to fix bikes and do odd jobs. It had started to feel like home. Emma's laughter, soft but real, had started to fill the space, and her drawings were scattered across the small table by the window. She talked more now, sharing small stories of her life before, of her mom, of the things she liked to do. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jake didn't feel so isolated. He still wasn't the type to express his feelings, not in words, but there was a shift in him. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. One evening, after a long day of work, Emma came up to him, her eyes bright with excitement. "Jake, guess what?" she said, holding up a small drawing she had done. He looked up from the bike he was working on, wiping his hands on a rag. "What is it?" She grinned. "It's you. I drew you fixing bikes, just like you do every day." Jake chuckled, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "I don't think I look that good in a drawing," he said, walking over to take a closer look. The picture was simple, but it captured something about him he hadn't expected, the focus he had when he was working, the way his hands moved with precision. It was a small moment, but it hit him harder than he thought it would. She had noticed him, not just as a biker or a stranger who had taken her in, but as someone worth drawing, worth remembering. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt a warmth spread through him. It wasn't something he could easily explain, but it was real. And as he looked at Emma's small face, full of hope and trust, he realized how much she had already changed his life. She had come into his world when he had been least expecting it, when he had been running away from everything that mattered. And now, she was teaching him to stop, to care of her. But he realized that he wanted to share this part of his life with her, to show her the world he had lived in for so long. He helped her onto the bike, making sure she was settled in behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist. "Hold on tight," he said, giving her a quick glance over his shoulder. She nodded, her small hands gripping his jacket. As they rode through the open road, the wind rushing past them, Jake felt a sense of freedom he hadn't experienced in years. It was the kind of freedom that came with letting go of the past, of the guilt and the anger that had weighed him down for so long. And as he glanced back at Emma, her hair flying in the wind and her face lit up with excitement, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had found something better than freedom. He had found a reason to stay. When they returned to the garage later that day, Emma was buzzing with energy, telling Jake all about how she felt the wind and how fast they had gone. It was a simple thing, but to her, it was everything. Jake had never realized how much these small moments meant until now. As the days turned into weeks, Jake began to feel a sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of it. He had Emma now, and that was enough. One afternoon, as Jake was sitting on the workbench, polishing a bike, Emma came up to him, holding something behind her back. "I have a surprise for you," she said, her eyes twinkling. Jake raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A surprise?" Emma nodded and pulled out a small, handmade bracelet, carefully crafted from beads and string. She handed it to him with a shy smile. "It's for you. To say thank you for everything." Jake's heart swelled. He hadn't expected anything in return. He hadn't done anything to deserve a thank you. But as he took the bracelet in his hands, he realized that this was more than just a gift. It was a symbol of everything they had been through together, of the bond they had formed in such a short time. He didn't know how to respond, so he simply smiled and slipped the bracelet onto his wrist. "Thank you, Emma," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She smiled up at him, her eyes shining with joy. "You're welcome, Jake." In that moment, Jake realized something that had taken him a long time to understand. He had spent his life searching for something, always thinking it was out there on the road, somewhere far away. But now, he knew that what he had been searching for all along had been right here, in front of him. It had been a few weeks since Jake had let Emma in, and every day she seemed to grow a little bit more comfortable. They had settled into a routine, the kind of quiet comfort Jake had never thought possible. There were still moments of doubt, moments where he found himself wondering if he was doing the right thing. But when he saw Emma smile, when he watched her draw or talk about her day, those doubts faded into the background. The weight of the world still hung on his shoulders, but it didn't feel so heavy anymore. One afternoon, after a morning of tinkering with bikes, Jake found himself sitting outside on the small porch of the garage. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden glow across the land, and Emma was inside, working on another one of her drawings. He had come to appreciate these moments of stillness, when everything felt like it was in its right place. He thought back to the days when the road had been his only companion, when he had felt invincible, untouchable. But now, with Emma there, it was different. He didn't feel invincible anymore. He felt human. He had started to open up in ways he hadn't before. Not with words, but with actions. It was strange, this feeling of care, this desire to protect, to make sure Emma was okay. It wasn't something he was used to. And yet, he found himself looking out for her safety, for her well-being, in ways he hadn't even known he was capable of. He could still remember the first time he had brought her into his life, that moment on the road when he had stopped for her, when he had taken a chance on someone who had nothing left. It seemed like a lifetime ago now. As the days passed, Emma had started to share more of her story, little pieces at a time. It wasn't easy for her, and Jake never pressed her to speak about things she wasn't ready to talk about. But bit by bit, she opened up about her life before the garage, about her mom, and about the things she used to do. Jake didn't push, he just listened. He wasn't good at talking about feelings, about emotions, but he knew how to listen. He had spent years being alone, keeping people at arm's length, but now, with Emma, he was learning that sometimes, just being there was enough. That afternoon, as Jake sat on the porch, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Emma's voice. "Jake, can I ask you something?" she called from inside. He turned to face her, his heart shifting at the sound of her voice. "Of course. What's up?" Emma stepped outside, holding the drawing she had been working on. "I was wondering, do you ever think about what comes next?" she asked, her eyes meeting his. Jake was taken aback by the question. What came next? That was a question he had spent most of his life avoiding. He had never allowed himself to think about the future, about what happened after the ride was over. It had always been about the here and now. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Emma shifted nervously, holding her drawing close to her chest. "Like, what happens when you stop writing? Or when things change?" Jake didn't know how to answer that. He had always thought the ride was the only thing that mattered, that as long as he kept moving, he could escape the past. But with Emma here, with everything that had happened between them, he realized that maybe he was ready for something more. Maybe it wasn't about running anymore. Maybe it was about staying, about building something new. "I guess I've never really thought about it," Jake said after a long pause. He looked at Emma, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw what she was asking. "But I think, maybe it's time to start thinking about it. About what comes next." Emma smiled softly, her face lighting up with the first real sense of hope Jake had seen in her eyes since she had arrived. "I think that's a good idea," she said, her voice filled with a quiet certainty. Jake sat back in his chair, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just said. For years, he had been running from everything, from his past, from the life he had built. But now, with Emma, it felt like maybe it was time to stop running. It felt like maybe he could finally face the future. They sat there for a while, the sound of crickets in the distance filling the silence between them. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, the kind that made Jake feel like they were both on the same page, like they both understood something unspoken. "You know," Jake said after a while, breaking the silence, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad you're here." Emma looked up at him, a smile spreading across her face. "Me too." And in that moment, Jake realized that maybe, just maybe, this was where he was supposed to be. He had spent so many years searching for meaning, for purpose, but he hadn't found it on the road, in the noise, or in the chaos. He had found it here, in this small garage, with this little girl who had taught him how to care, how to stay, how to face the future without fear. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he had a reason to keep going, a reason to stop running. And as he looked at Emma, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. As the weeks passed, Jake and Emma settled into a rhythm that felt almost like a family. The routine was simple, but it gave Jake a sense of purpose he had never known before. Each morning, he would wake early, start the coffee, and prepare for another day in the garage. Emma, always up before the sun, would follow him into the space, her eyes bright with curiosity and the eagerness to learn. It was these small moments, her questions, her laughter, that began to fill the silence Jake had lived with for so long. They weren't just passing time anymore. They were building something. One afternoon, as Jake was adjusting the engine of an old Harley, Emma came into the garage holding a small box. "Jake, I found this." "In the attic," she said, her voice full of excitement. "What is it?" Jake wiped his hands on a rag and looked up, surprised by the small box in her hands. She handed it to him, her fingers brushing against his as she did. It was a small, wooden box, worn from age, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. Jake took it from her, studying the intricate carvings along the edges. "What's inside?" he asked, his voice soft. Emma shrugged, her eyes wide. "I don't know. I thought it might be important." Jake slowly lifted the lid. Inside, there were several old photographs, yellowed with time, and a few faded letters tied with string. He pulled them out one by one, carefully inspecting each item. The photographs were of a woman, her face young and full of life. She looked familiar, but Jake couldn't place her. There was something about her smile that seemed to tug at a memory deep inside him. "Do you recognize her?" Emma asked, her voice filled with curiosity. Jake shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but she looks like someone I used to know." He turned the photo over and found a name written in delicate script. Maggie. Maggie. The name rang a bell, but Jake couldn't remember where he had heard it before. He put the photo down and reached for the letters. The handwriting was elegant, but the ink had faded over time, making the words difficult to read. He squinted, trying to make out the faint writing. The first letter was dated many years ago, the words carefully written on the page. "To my dearest Jake, I will always love you. No matter where life takes us, you will always be my heart's home. With all my love, Maggie." Jake felt a lump form in his throat as he read the letter. It was clear now. This was from someone he had loved, someone he had lost. His past had always been something he kept buried, but now, as the memories resurfaced, he realized how much of it had shaped who he was today. He looked up at Emma, her curious eyes watching him carefully. She didn't ask any questions. She just waited for him to speak. "This was from a long time ago," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "Maggie. She was someone special to me." Emma nodded, not pushing him to say more. "Do you miss her?" she asked softly. Jake paused, his mind racing. He had buried so much of his past, so much of the pain that had come with losing Maggie. But now, with Emma here, everything felt different. He had never allowed himself to feel anything before. But now, with her quiet understanding, he felt something stir inside him. "I do," Jake said, his voice low. "But I've moved on. I had to." Emma didn't reply. She just sat there beside him, her small hand resting gently on his. For the first time in years, Jake felt like he wasn't alone in his pain. He had always kept people at a distance, keeping his heart locked away. But now, with Emma, he realized that maybe it was okay to let someone in. He hadn't been sure how to be a father figure, or even how to be there for her, but with each passing day, Emma was teaching him. She had a way of making everything feel simpler, of making him believe that it was okay to care. As the day wore on, Jake and Emma went back to working on bikes in the garage, the small box and its contents sitting quietly in the corner. But Jake couldn't stop thinking about it. The letter, the memories, the woman he had once loved. It was as if a piece of his past had finally been brought back into the light. And for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of it. The day slipped into evening, and as they finished up, Emma came over to Jake, her face serious. "Jake, you know, you don't have to do everything by yourself. You have me now." Jake looked down at her, his heart swelling with a mixture of emotions he couldn't name. He didn't know how to respond at first, but then, with a small smile, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "I know, Emma, and I'm grateful for that." It wasn't much, but it was the truth. For the first time in a long time, Jake didn't feel like he had to carry the weight of the world on his own. And as he looked at Emma, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he was finally learning how to let go of the past and step into the future. Together, Jake sat on the worn leather chair, his eyes tracing the lines of the old motorcycle before him. The engine sat open, parts scattered across the workbench, but his mind wasn't on the bike. It was on Emma. It had been a few weeks since the discovery of the box with Maggie's letters, and though Jake hadn't spoken much about it, something in him had shifted. He had been pushing away the feelings, burying them deep down, but now, it was harder to ignore them. He had never expected to care about anyone the way he cared about Emma. She had wormed her way into his life, and though he had resisted it at first, he knew now that he couldn't imagine a life without her in it. She had changed him in ways he hadn't thought possible. Emma was different now, too. She had grown more confident. Her drawings had become more colorful, more intricate. She smiled more, and when she did, it reached her eyes. There were still moments where the past seemed to shadow her, but she didn't hide it anymore. Jake had learned to read her, the way she would get quiet at certain times, her eyes distant, but he didn't push her to talk. They both understood that some things needed time. "Jake!" Emma's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see her standing at the door of the garage, her hands tucked into the pockets of her oversized sweatshirt. "Yeah," he answered, trying to shake off the heaviness that had settled on his chest. "Can we go out for a walk? I've been cooped up in here all day," she said, her face hopeful. Jake smiled, setting down the wrench he had been holding. "Sure, kid. We can take a break." He stood up and wiped his hands on a rag before grabbing his jacket. The air outside was crisp, the early fall chill still hanging in the air, but it was a welcome change after the heat of the garage. They walked in silence at first, the crunch of leaves under their feet the only sound between them. The woods around the property were quiet, peaceful. Jake felt the familiar calm that came with the outdoors, but this time, it wasn't just the solitude he was enjoying. It was the company. Emma walked beside him, her hands in her pockets, her head tilted slightly as she looked up at the trees. The sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows on the ground. "I used to come out here with my mom," Emma said after a while, her voice soft. Jake glanced at her, his steps slowing. "Yeah," he asked, his voice gentle. "Yeah," she continued, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. "She used to take me on walks like this, just to get away from everything. It was nice. It felt like we could talk about anything." Jake's heart tightened at the mention of her mom. He knew Emma missed her, but hearing it out loud made it feel more real. She was just a kid, and yet she had already lost so much. "I think she would have liked you," Emma added quietly, glancing up at Jake. "She would have thought you were pretty cool." Jake was taken aback. The words hit him harder than he expected. He wasn't sure how to respond. It was the kind of compliment he had never gotten before, not from anyone. And it meant more to him than he was willing to admit. "Thanks, Emma," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. They continued walking, the path winding through the woods, leading them to a small clearing. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting an orange glow over the landscape. They stopped for a moment, and Jake looked at Emma, noticing how much she had changed. She wasn't the scared little girl he had found on the side of the road anymore. She was strong, resilient, and she had brought something out of him that he hadn't known was there. "You're doing better, you know," Jake said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I've seen a lot of kids go through tough things, but you've handled it better than most adults would." Emma gave him a small smile, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I think it's because of you," she said softly. Jake was surprised by her words, and he didn't know how to respond. He had always believed he was the one who needed to be strong, but here she was, saying that he had helped her. It was a humbling thought. They stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle between them, each lost in their own thoughts. Then, Emma spoke again. "Jake, do you think things will always be like this? With me living here, I mean?" Her question caught him off guard. He had been so focused on getting through each day that he hadn't really thought about the future. "I don't know," he said honestly, his gaze shifting to the horizon. "But I do know this. You're part of my life now. And as long as you need me, I'll be here." Emma's face softened, and she nodded. "Thanks, Jake," she whispered. The moment hung in the air, heavy with unspoken understanding. They didn't need to say much more. The bond between them was stronger than words could express. As they made their way back to the garage, Jake felt a sense of peace wash over him. For the first time in years, he wasn't questioning his decisions or wondering if he was making a mistake. He was exactly where he was meant to be. And for the first time in his life, that was enough. The mornings had begun to feel routine, but in the best way possible. Jake woke up before the sun, like always, but now he did it with a purpose. The air was crisp, the lights soft as it crept through the windows of the garage, casting long shadows over the tools, the bikes, and the workbench. For the first time in years, Jake didn't feel like something was missing. He wasn't running anymore. He had found something he hadn't even realized he was looking for. Emma had become a part of his life in ways he hadn't expected. The little girl who had stumbled into his world with nothing but fear and hope had now settled into his routine. She was stronger, more confident. Every day, she grew a little more, and Jake found himself growing with her. He wasn't sure how it happened, but she had found a way to fill the emptiness that had been his for so long. Every day, they worked together in the garage, side by side. It wasn't just about fixing bikes anymore. It was about building something more meaningful. They didn't need to say much. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding. There were moments, though, when Emma would look up from her drawings or the bike she was working on, and Jake would catch the sadness in her eyes. He knew she missed her mom. He could see it. In the way her gaze would wander, the way her hand would pause mid-stroke when she was drawing. He didn't press her to talk about it. He didn't need to. She knew he understood. It was a quiet bond they shared, a bond that didn't need words. And sometimes, when she was in one of those quiet moods, he would sit with her, not saying anything, just letting her be. Those moments, to Jake, felt like the heart of their connection. One evening, As the day began to fade into night, Emma stood in the doorway of the garage, looking out into the darkening sky. Jake wiped his hands on a rag and stood up from the workbench. He could tell something was on her mind. "You okay?" he asked, his voice calm but attentive. Emma nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the frame of the door. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, "about what comes next." Jake raised an eyebrow, moving to stand next to her. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her eyes focused on the sky, but her voice was steady. "I don't want to stay here forever, Jake. I mean, I like it here. It's just, sometimes, I think about what happens when I'm older, or when you can't be here anymore." Jake's heart tightened at her words, but he kept his expression steady. He hadn't thought about the future like that, not in terms of Emma and what would happen when she was no longer a child, when she had grown into someone with her own life. "You don't have to worry about that right now," Jake said softly. "You're here with me, and that's all that matters." Emma looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. "But I will have to leave one day, won't I?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's heart sank. He had never thought about it in those terms. He had always been so focused on the present, on making sure Emma was okay in the here and now. The thought of her leaving, of her growing up and finding her own way in the world, was something he hadn't allowed himself to consider. "We all have to leave one day," Jake said after a long pause, his voice thick with emotion. "But that doesn't mean you're not a part of me. No matter where you go, or what happens, you're always going to be my family." Emma smiled softly, her eyes brightening as if Jake's words had lifted a weight off her shoulders. "I'll always be here, too," she said, her voice full of sincerity. Jake nodded, feeling the warmth in her words. They stood there for a moment, side by side, looking out at the darkening sky. In that silence, Jake realized something. He had spent so much of his life running, avoiding the future, avoiding attachment, but now, with Emma, he was learning how to be present. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He didn't want to lose this. The garage, the bikes, the quiet moments with Emma. It had become his life in a way he hadn't expected, and it felt like it was where he belonged. As the days passed, Jake found himself thinking less about the road ahead and more about the moments they shared. Every day brought something new, a laugh, a question, a quiet afternoon spent together. And for the first time in years, Jake found himself living in the moment, not running from it. One evening, after dinner, Emma came up to Jake with something in her hands. "I made something for you," she said, holding out a small wooden box, carefully carved and painted with bright colors. Jake took it from her, his fingers tracing the smooth surface. "What is it?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Open it," Emma said with a smile. Jake carefully lifted the lid, revealing a small key, wrapped in a piece of cloth. He looked up at Emma, surprised. "A key?" he asked. Emma nodded, her eyes shining. "It's a key to whatever you want it to be," she said softly. "A key to your future. A key to your dreams. A key to your heart." Jake's breath caught in his chest. It was just a simple key, but the meaning behind it, Emma's words, the weight of the moment, made it feel like more. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't alone. And no matter what came next, he would face it with Emma by his side, just like they had always done. Together. The weeks seemed to blur together in the most unexpected way. Jake had always been someone who cherished the quiet, the stillness of solitude. But now with Emma by his side, he found that the silence was different. It was no longer oppressive or lonely. It was comforting. It was the kind of silence that meant you didn't have to say anything to understand each other. The days in the garage were filled with shared moments, no longer just about fixing bikes, but about the little things that made a house feel like a home. Emma's laughter echoed through the walls as she showed him her latest drawings, all bright colors and endless imagination. Jake found himself smiling more often, a small thing that meant more than he ever realized. The weight of his past, the memories he had locked away, were still there, lingering in the background. But with Emma, it was different. She had become a part of his life, and for the first time in years, Jake didn't feel the need to run. He wasn't sure how it had happened, but as the days passed, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was the way Emma had grown, her confidence blooming, or maybe it was the way she looked at him with trust, something he hadn't earned from anyone in a long time. He had started to believe that maybe he was worthy of that trust. It was late one afternoon when the first sign that things were changing came. Jake had been working on an old Harley, and Emma had been sitting on the porch, drawing. The sun was beginning to set, casting the garage in a soft orange light. Jake wiped his hands on a rag and stepped outside, feeling the cool breeze against his face. Emma was still sitting on the steps, but now, there was something different about her. She wasn't just drawing anymore. She was staring at the horizon, her expression distant. Jake walked over and sat next to her, the silence between them comfortable. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice low. Emma didn't answer right away. She just kept looking at the setting sun, the colors shifting across the sky. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I've been thinking about my mom," she said. Jake felt his chest tighten at the mention of her mother. He had always known that Emma missed her, but hearing her say it aloud made it feel so much more real. He had never been a father, never thought he'd be the one to help a child through something like this. But here he was, and the weight of it settled on him. "I think she would have liked it here," Emma continued, her voice cracking slightly. "She would have liked you." The words hit Jake harder than he expected. He had spent so many years keeping people at a distance, building walls around himself, and now Emma, this little girl who had entered his life without warning, was telling him that he mattered. He wasn't sure how to respond, so he just sat quietly next to her, letting the moment stretch between them. They sat like that for a while, watching as the last of the daylight faded away, the stars beginning to twinkle in the sky above them. It was peaceful, and for a moment, Jake allowed himself to let go of the constant need to protect himself, to push people away. Maybe he wasn't so alone after all. Emma's voice broke the silence again. "Jake, do you think I'll ever be okay?" Jake turned to look at her, his heart aching. "You're already stronger than you think," he said softly. Emma's eyes met his, searching for something in his words. She didn't say anything, but Jake could see the doubt in her expression. He understood. He had spent years feeling the same way, wondering if he could ever truly move on from the past. But now, with Emma, he was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, it was possible. "You've been through a lot," Jake continued, his voice steady. "And it's okay to not have all the answers right now. But you're not alone in this. I'm here, and we'll figure it out together." Emma nodded slowly, her lips curving into a small smile. It was the first time in a long time that Jake had seen her truly smile, and it made something inside him soften. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending that he didn't care, that the walls he had built up over the years could keep him safe. The truth was, Emma had cracked those walls open, piece by piece, and now, he didn't want them back up. As the night wore on, they sat outside, talking quietly about everything and nothing. Jake found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected, sharing bits of his own past with Emma. He told her about the road, about the Hells Angels, and about the choices he had made that had led him here. It wasn't easy, but with Emma there, it felt like it was okay to share, to be vulnerable. By the time they went inside, the stars were bright in the sky, and Jake felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The road ahead was still uncertain, but with Emma beside him, he didn't feel as afraid of it. They would face whatever came next together, and for Jake, that was enough. The days had begun to blur into a comfortable routine, and Jake found himself settling into a life he never thought possible. Every morning, the quiet hum of the garage greeted him as he started his day. The sound of tools clinking, the smell of oil, and the sight of Emma working by his side became the steady rhythm of his life. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and for the first time in years, Jake felt content. Emma had come a long way from the frightened girl he had found on the side of the road. She was stronger now, more confident in herself, and her once uncertain eyes had become full of curiosity and hope. She spent her days drawing, fixing small things around the garage, and asking Jake endless questions about bikes and life. It was the first time Jake had really let anyone into his world, and in some strange way, it felt like they were building something important together. One evening, as the sun began to set, Jake sat on the porch, sipping his coffee and watching the sky change colors. The wind rustled the leaves, and the air was crisp, a reminder that fall was settling in. Emma came out to join him, her hands tucked into the pockets of her hoodie. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice soft but serious. Jake glanced up at her and smiled. "Of course, kid. What's on your mind?" Emma hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching the sky. Do you ever wonder what it would be like to just leave? To start over somewhere else? Jake set his coffee cup down on the table and looked at her thoughtfully. It was a question he had asked himself many times in the past, but the answer was different now. He wasn't the same man who had ridden from place to place, always looking for the next thing to escape to. He had found something here. Something real. I used to, he said, his voice calm. I used to think about it all the time. But you know, sometimes the place we're looking for isn't somewhere out there. Sometimes, it's just right in front of us, right where we are. Emma was quiet for a moment, her face softening as she processed his words. She had always been a quiet child, but over the past few weeks, Jake had noticed that she was becoming more expressive, more willing to share what was on her mind. I think I get it, she said finally, her voice steady. I think this place, with you, it's where I'm supposed to be. Jake's heart tightened at her words. He hadn't expected her to say that, but hearing it made something inside him shift. You've come a long way, Emma, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And you've made this place feel like home. The two of them sat in silence for a while, the sun dipping below the horizon. Jake's mind wandered back to the road, to the years he had spent running from his past, from the mistakes he had made, and the person he used to be. But now, with Emma, he didn't feel like he needed to run anymore. She had shown him a different way of living, a way that didn't require constant motion, that didn't require him to bury his emotions. She had given him the chance to stop and breathe. It was a gift he hadn't realized he needed. As the night fell and the stars began to appear, Jake and Emma made their way back inside. They went through their evening routine, eating dinner, cleaning up, and then sitting in the quiet of the living room. The TV was on, but neither of them really paid attention to it. Instead, they just sat together, enjoying the comfort of each other's presence. Jake, Emma said suddenly, breaking the silence. What if I told you I wanted to stay here? Forever? Jake turned to look at her, his heart skipping a beat. You're already here, kid, he said, his voice gentle but firm. You don't have to ask. This is your home. Emma smiled, her eyes filled with something Jake hadn't seen before, a sense of peace. I know, she said softly. I just wanted to hear you say it. Jake smiled back, his chest tightening with emotion. It wasn't a promise he had ever thought he would make, but now, it felt like the most important one he could give. He had been a man who spent his whole life moving from place to place, never settling, never belonging. But now, with Emma, he had found a place where he belonged, and he wasn't going anywhere. They spent the rest of the evening in the quiet of the garage, working on the bikes, sharing stories, and laughing together. It was simple, but it was everything. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he had something to hold on to, something worth staying for. Emma had become more than just a child he had taken in. She had become his family. And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of the garage and the soft glow of the porch light, Jake realized that he wasn't just a biker anymore. He was a father, and it was a role he was learning to embrace, one day at a time. The air had turned cooler as the weeks moved on, and the quiet of the garage had become more familiar, almost comforting. Jake and Emma had settled into an unspoken routine that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. There was something about the simple act of sharing space, the shared silences, the small moments of connection that made Jake feel more at home than he had in years. Every morning, the two of them worked side by side, fixing bikes, tending to the garage, and filling the space with a quiet sense of purpose. For Jake, it wasn't just about the work anymore. It was about being present, being here with Emma, helping her build something stronger within herself. She wasn't the same girl who had walked into his life uncertain and afraid. She was growing, blooming, and for the first time, Jake could see the future with more clarity. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid to face it. One afternoon, as the autumn leaves began to fall, Jake and Emma were working on a bike in the garage. Emma was focused on tightening a bolt, her brow furrowed in concentration. Jake stood back, watching her for a moment. It amazed him how far she had come. She had gone from a girl who couldn't look him in the eye to someone who was actively learning, growing, and showing strength he hadn't expected. She had become more than just a child in need of protection. She was his partner in a way, his companion. Emma looked up from her work and caught Jake staring at her. "What's up?" she asked, her voice light. Jake smiled softly. "You've come a long way, you know that?" Emma tilted her head, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. I guess so, she said, wiping a smear of grease from her cheek. I've learned a lot from you. Jake's heart swelled at her words. She didn't realize it, but she had taught him just as much as he had taught her. She had taught him how to open up, how to care again, and how to face the future without fear. He hadn't realized how much he needed someone like her in his life. You've been doing great, Jake said. I'm proud of you. Emma's smile grew, and for a moment, Jake forgot about the weight of the world. He forgot about the mistakes of his past, the years spent alone. In that moment, it was just the two of them, working together, building something better. I'm proud of you too, Jake, Emma said softly, her eyes meeting his. Jake's chest tightened. She had come to mean more to him than he had ever imagined. She was a constant reminder of how much life had to offer, how much he had missed out on by running away from everything. I don't know if I've told you this, Jake began, his voice quiet. But you've changed my life. I was lost before you came here. I never thought I'd be able to build something like this. Emma paused, her hands stilling for a moment as she looked up at him. You're not alone anymore, she said simply. The words hit Jake like a wave, crashing over him with a sudden intensity. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that until now. She was right. He wasn't alone anymore. He had someone who cared, someone who looked to him not as a stranger or a protector, but as family. As the days passed, Jake found himself thinking more about the future, about what would come next. They were building a life together, one that was simple, but real. There were still days when Jake felt the weight of his past, the mistakes he had made, but with Emma by his side, those days became easier to bear. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Jake and Emma sat on the porch, the soft glow of the fading light casting long shadows across the yard. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them felt comfortable. Emma leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. Jake wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. It was moments like these that made everything feel right. They didn't need to say anything. They didn't need to fill the silence with words. They were just two people, connected by something deeper than either of them had expected. Jake. Emma's voice broke the quiet, and Jake turned his head to look at her. Yeah. Do you ever think about what my mom would have wanted for me? Emma asked, her voice small. Jake's heart tightened. He had known this moment would come, the moment when Emma would need to confront the loss of her mother. I think your mom would have wanted you to be happy, Jake said softly, his thumb brushing gently across her hand. She would have wanted you to find peace, to find your place in this world, just like you're doing now. Emma nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I miss her, she whispered. Jake didn't have the words to make the pain go away. All he could do was hold her, to remind her that she wasn't alone. I know you do, he said softly. And I'm here. I'll always be here for you. Emma smiled up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. Thanks, Jake. I don't know where I'd be without you. Jake squeezed her hand, his chest tight with emotion. You don't have to thank me, Emma. You've given me more than I could ever give you. They sat in silence for a long while, the night settling around them. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. They had found something together, something worth holding on to. And in that moment, Jake realized that he didn't need anything more. He had found his home in Emma, and that was all he needed.